maybe all know I'm Villa Noordzee, the PBL expert at EUC, but I hardly know anything about the history of PBL. So I was so glad that Ginie came to EUC with a PhD on the history and philosophy of PBL. So I learned a lot from her, and I hope you all will learn a lot from her about the history of PBL. You all know her, so I don't think she needs any introduction to you. So I proudly present Ginie.
Is there a clicker, or do I have to press the...
You have to press it.
Okay, I have to press the screen. No worries. Alright, I think I'll use the microphone just for the sake of not having to shout. But thank you so much for coming here this morning, especially considering the weather outside. I can understand that it's really challenging to stay in a lecture hall all day. So I'm going to try to make this as relevant to you as possible. And essentially the idea is I'm going to explain to you where you've come from, as PBL students, what is your history, but not just in terms of what's happened over the past 40 to 45 years, but in terms of where did the ideas for all of this come from. And this is really important. The message I'm going to leave you with is what you can do with those ideas with your future. So yes, just to give you a bit of a background, my PhD title is Revolutionary Iterations and Intellectual History of Problem-Based Learning. And I chose that title because I wanted to show that whilst it was a revolutionary move to set up PBL in the 1960s, actually it was inherited from a large tradition of philosophical ideas. Okay, so let us begin. Our journey begins in the 1960s, the swinging 60s, at the end of the 1960s. As you all know, the 60s was a bit of an interesting time, full of hippies and people with funny hair and trousers. And it was also a time of great change in education, with a lot of student protests. And so our journey begins in 1969, when a small Canadian medical school opened with a program. They didn't call it PBL until 1974, but essentially that's what it was. And as you can see, the real kickoff was in the 1970s, when many universities from around the world decided to join this movement. Not all thought they were doing the same thing, so it's all of these ideas kind of merged together, as I will explain. But you can see many countries represented here. The first two are from Denmark, Roskilde and Aalborg. Then we have the Dutch in 74. Then in 75, the Australians. In 79, the first Asian program in Malaysia. And in 79, the American program in New Mexico. In 85, something interesting happened. Harvard Medical School came upon this PBL idea and thought, ooh, this is great. Why don't we try to adapt this? And then they said, we shall call it the New Pathway Curriculum. And then they said, hey, we invented PBL. They didn't, don't believe them. They actually copied it wholesale from McMaster. And then back to Europe in 86, a Swedish university at Linköping adopted it. And then in the 90s, we have a booming of PBL, where over 100 institutions have adopted PBL around the world. And you can see the first Japanese university, Tokyo Women's Medical University, the first Indonesian university at Gajah Mada, the University of Hong Kong switches to PBL, and these are just the Asian ones because those are the ones I know, but there was the same movement in Latin America, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Chile, and in Africa, in Egypt, in Nigeria. All these countries were developing these new programs, and today there are more than 500 universities that use some form of PBL. Alright, so let me take you back to class of 1972, those are the ones who started in 1969, of course, for a 3-year bachelor. They graduated in 72. As you can see, the sense of fashion was slightly different back then. And you can also see and notice these guys are older than you were, because in America, medicine is a graduate program, which means that you go in there after you've already finished your bachelor degree, which means the PBL was actually invented for what you might call master's students nowadays. And that kind of explains this idea that somehow they had to be adult or autonomous learners. And this program, at the back you can see the founding professors, and we'll talk a little bit more about them because they were really important people. You see, one of the things that I found in my research, I was expecting to find a whole history of ideas, boring things about institutions, no offense to the institutions people here, but what I actually found was that PBL was the fruit of people's ideas. that it was people who changed education, not institutions, and that one single person had the power to change education for not only their institution, but ultimately, if you look 45 years down the line, for the whole world. And that man is the man in the middle, John Evans. He was only 35 years old when they named him dean, the founding dean of McMaster School of Medicine. And they chose him over more senior candidates because they knew he could do something different. And at the time there was money available. So why not do something different? And John Evans was a very charismatic man, a very profound man. Not a man of practical details, but a man who had ideas. And his idea was, let us do something different. Lectures are boring. That was what he said. He said, you cannot learn medicine by cramming lectures down your throat. You must learn medicine by starting with problems. But he was not alone. And he was not a man to implement a program, just to come up with the ideas. His right-hand man, which I've actually put on the left, was Bill Spalding. And Spalding was a man of very practical and precise detail. A man who liked things to be on time and done as it says in the books. And he is the one who wrote this whole idea of blocks. They called them unit at the time. But it was revolutionary. Can you imagine that for centuries medicine had been taught one subject at a time? And this guy said, no, we're going to make units or blocks instead, where you can spend 6 weeks, it was, or 8 weeks, doing just one thing, focusing on just one thing. And we're not going to do it with courses where you have to memorize all this information. No, we're going to do it with problems. And all the problems are going to be centered around systems. And these systems are going to be the cardiovascular system, the gastrointestinal system. And today that translates as a course on origins, a course on institutions. You can thank this man. And then beneath you have Fraser Mustard, otherwise known as the Elk. For his forceful personality. He's been described by some as flashbang lightning. And this was a guy who was a world specialist in platelets, which is a cell in the blood. And this guy was a bit more of a conservative, a bit more of a force of nature, and he was famous for turning all tutorials into platelet lectures. And so, ironically, it was because of him and his tendency to lecture in tutorials that this idea of a non-expert tutor came about. Because they didn't want people turning tutorials or PBL meetings into lectures. And then there's the man that you can see on the bottom right, which is Bill Walsh. And Bill Walsh was essentially the man responsible for making the local community of Hamilton, where this university was built, accept a PBL university. Because it's not so easy when you build a new project with a new rational method of education to get people to accept it, especially in medicine. Doctors are rather conservative people. And this man, because he had influence in the community, managed to get them to accept it. And finally, I want to spend some time talking about Jim Anderson, because this is really my education hero. Jim Anderson, who you can see in the top right, was a very tragic man. He had a young son, about 10 years old, who died in a tragic accident in a gas explosion. And he decided to make up for this, to dedicate his life to educating young people. And as well as being a full professor of anatomy and a revolutionary in anatomy, he opened a school in his local town called the Cool School. And it was a school for kids that were struggling with drug abuse. And it was a school in which basically he did everything that we do in problem-based learning, but with these kids, to help them believe in their education again and get back on the right track in life. And he did all this pro bono as a voluntary. And he was named the Citizen of the Year of his town for his efforts. But most of all, he is the man who defined the role of the tutor in problem-based learning, who defined the tutor not as someone who will lecture, and he was the most ferocious opponent of Fraser Mustard, but as somebody who will guide you in your learning. So that's why he's my education hero. And essentially, what this goes to show is that PBL didn't really start as a kind of grand idea of let's revolutionize education, but more as a negative idea that lectures didn't work and we had to try something new. And that something new was going to be starting with problems. And why problems? Because if you're going to be a doctor, it's easy. You've got patients. They'll provide you with your problems. But that is not the end of the story. Almost at the same time, a university was built and set up just outside of Copenhagen in Denmark. And this story is fascinating because it happened almost at the same time as McMaster, except they knew nothing about each other. And this university was somewhat more revolutionary than McMaster, in the sense that in 1968-69 there were massive student protests in Denmark. Imagine students who were throwing records out of their offices, they were taking over the university, they were putting up barricades. I know it sounds very French, except contrarily to the French, they actually did something about it and decided to open a new university that could satisfy the students' demands. And so there was a man who, at the age of 21, was head of the Student Union of Denmark, and in collaboration with the Social Democrat Party of Denmark, became one of the founding fathers of this university. Yes, students had half the stake in defining how this university should be built, because it was a time where students were listened to in politics. It came with downsides, of course, and as you can see from these wonderful paper clippings that I found in the archives. There's a lot of talk about Marxism, and indeed, they call this a red nest, and that's a pretty accurate description. Basically, every radical hippie and Marxist person in Copenhagen ended up in this university, to the point where they staged a coup against the rector after a couple of years and kicked him out, and replaced him with a puppet for the more radical communist elements in the university. Now, Parliament didn't take too kindly to this, especially at the time the Social Democrats had lost the election, and the Conservative Party was back in power, and they held a vote to close the university. And that vote, if you can imagine Parliament, there were 20,000 students outside of Parliament protesting. And that vote was won in favor of the university by one vote. And that one vote was a member of the Conservative Party that voted against his own party. Otherwise, they would have closed down this university. And the university was copied in '74 in a very remote province of Denmark. And so there the model was able to develop without all the political interference of Copenhagen. And you'll ask me, well, what is this model? So this is the man that was 21 at the time, and who I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing last year. He's still around, he's still Marxist, not quite as revolutionary, but he told me there were three ideas behind this PBL program, or as it was called, problem-oriented project-based learning. One, autonomy, that you have the right to define the study orientation and the content of your education. Two, that it is problem-oriented, which means that the curriculum is not defined by disciplines or subdisciplines, but by questions that arise from society. And three, that it should be interdisciplinary, which means you get rid of disciplinary boundaries. And essentially, the way to organize this was in projects that would last a whole semester, where students would organize themselves in groups of up to 7, go out into the community, work with local partners, build projects, and then hand in reports at the end to the university to get a mark, but also to the partners so it contributed to society. And I will explain why this was so important a bit later when I get into the philosophy. And finally, in 1974, PBL comes to the Netherlands, woohoo, we were fourth. And this is actually the first tutorial group of my PhD supervisor in 1976 in Maastricht Medical School. And you can see wonderful for medical school ashtrays on the tables. But what was the difference between this program and the McMaster program? Because they essentially copied the program, they chartered a plane to go to McMaster to see what they were doing. The difference is, look at their age. These guys are your age. It was the first bachelor program in PBL. And so they said, we can't be as liberal as they were in Canada because it just doesn't work with 18-year-olds. They're just not ready to structure their own learning. And that's when Hank Schmid, my PhD supervisor, decided, aha, I'm going to develop a 7-step method for PBL around 1976. And that method is the method that you know today. It hasn't much changed since 1976, but it was essentially designed to help younger students structure their own learning process until they were ready to do it on their own. That's where that method comes from. That's why it was invented, to help you structure your own learning. And Hank Schmid, who I talked to other times last year, I asked him what was the essence of this Maastricht program. He said, well, unlike McMaster, where they had this idea that it was all about problem solving, in Maastricht we were really interested in the content of the problem, not problem solving, problem understanding. Because you're not a doctor yet, you don't need to solve the patient's case yet, you need to understand why he's sick. And the same applies to every discipline that uses PBL nowadays. It's about understanding the content, not about solving problems that you can do when you're in the professional world. Okay, so that's a historical overview of the founding programs. But really, what is it all about? Well, it begins, as with many things, with the Socratic method, which was related to us by Plato, which is why some of you think that it's called the Platonic method, but actually it was Plato describing his teacher Socrates as he taught. And what did Socrates do? Socrates would teach people by asking them questions. By asking them questions which would lead them to find by themselves answers they did not know they possessed, but which they already did possess. So long before cognitive psychology was ever invented, he already had some notion that somehow we could help people, guide people to go just a step further in their learning. Many centuries later, we arrive at the beginning of this century, and then we have a movement which I would call humanist, but for the sake of this presentation we'll call self-directionist, which is not a very nice word, but it begins in medical education with Abraham Flexner. Flexner is most famous for writing a very boring survey of 155 universities in America, but that wasn't the real heart of his work. The real heart of his work, as I discovered, is he was one of the first to say, enough with lectures in medical education. We need to give students a chance to practice things, to feel things with their hands. We need to give students a chance to go out into the community and understand what it means to be a doctor. And he said this in 1910. None of this hippie stuff. You can imagine guys with their bowler hats talking about education already as we see it now. But the most important, two people that you really have to remember, John Dewey. John Dewey, arguably the greatest education philosopher of our time, of the last century, and I think today still hasn't been equaled, was a man who believed essentially that education cannot be divided from experience. What does that mean? If education doesn't tie into what you live and experience in your everyday life, it's pointless. If education doesn't have meaning to you as people, it's pointless. There is no dualism between theory and practice. Your education, your theoretical education, has to serve your interests, your beliefs. And he believed that was the only way we could achieve democracy. So not only was he an education philosopher, he was also a great Democrat. But the man that I have come to appreciate most, and it's ironic because I hated every word he wrote when I first read his book, is Carl Rogers. And I would say that everything I do as a tutor is inspired by Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was a man who wrote about freedom to learn. He believed in something called significant and experiential learning, meaning a form of learning that really profoundly touches at the heart of what it means to be human, that touches at who you want to be as individuals. He wrote about learning, so as Carl Rogers was a psychologist, he worked with mentally ill patients, and he developed something called client-centered therapy, which was a form of emotional therapy. And so he argued into getting emotions back into education because that was the only way to make it meaningful. And I love this quote from Dewey because I want to read it to you because it really encompasses the essence of the humanist vision of education, which is that an individual who has a question, which being really a question to him, instigates his curiosity, which feeds his eagerness for information that will help him cope with it, and who has at command an equipment which will permit these interests to take effect, is intellectually free. And that is the important thing, that in 1916 he recognized that there was such a thing as intellectual freedom. Not just education, intellectual freedom. Now, on the other side, we will come to the behaviorists. The behaviorists, well, you remember Skinner from your course in brain and behavior. They had this lovely thing with lab rats and rewards. And Skinner wrote an interesting little piece called The Teaching Machine, which essentially maps his ideas about lab rats onto students. And he believed that you could program students to learn, that you could get them through build steps and rewards to achieve measurable outcomes. And you might think, well, you know, it was just one crazy guy, but no, there was a whole school of these guys in the 1960s. Benjamin Bloom and his taxonomy. Yes, that little pyramid of all the things, all the little steps you have to take to learn. And finally, my favorite of all, Robert Major, who wrote this very instructive book. And I just wanted to read something in here from you because it sounds a bit to me like circus monkeys more than students. But you're welcome to disagree. He said, and the chapter is called Identifying the Terminal Behavior. I'm not making this up. And he says, a statement of an objective is useful to the extent that it is specific in what the learner must be able to do or perform when he is demonstrating his mastery of the objective. Since no one can see into the other's mind to determine what he knows, you can only determine the state of the learner's intellectual skill by observing some aspect of his behavioral performance. Yeah, because people can't talk really to explain what they're thinking. Luckily for us, in most PBL courses, the humanists won out, not the behaviorists. And this is another magnificent quote from Skinner, which reinforces this nice lab rat idea. You can tell I'm out of time. And then, one of my favorite bunches, they have my sympathy, although I don't always agree with them, the radicals. And this was a truly 1960s, 70s movement. You could also call them the Marxists. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And you can see from his hand movements here that he really meant what he said. And he did revolutionize education in Brazil, but not for long, because dictatorships kind of weeded that kind of radicalism out. But his ideas made their way into Germany. And there were two people in particular, Oskar Meck and Alexander Kluge, who wrote books about how learning should be exemplary, meaning it should reflect things that happen in society in real life, and be meaningful not just to the elite, remember they were Marxist, the bourgeois capitalist elite, but to the working people, to normal people. Where did their ideas come from? Okay, these two chaps. Now, I want you to imagine a fictitious dialogue between Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. And if you forgive me, I may take a silly German accent for this, but Karl Marx would say, but you know, the world is determined by das Kapital. It is a struggle between the proletarian and the bourgeois capital class. And Freud would say, so, no, it is actually about the ego, the libido. It is the repressed desires that determine the behavior of people. And Karl Marx would say, that is nonsense, it is all about class conflict. And Freud would say, I have an idea, why do we not combine the two? And then we have the psychosocial approach to education, combining the wonderful ideas of psychoanalysis and Marxism. What did we get? Well, we get a whole lot of literature about proletarian fantasy and education, but what we get really is a very strong critique of academic knowledge. It's an idea that specialized knowledge, academic knowledge, cannot reflect the experience of society, because it's a mode of specialized knowledge that cannot be adopted by the majority. And this, they say, doesn't have to do with the limits of academic speech, meaning jargon, or because somehow the proletarian are backwards, but because, and understand this, according to Marxist terms, academic knowledge as produced by the bourgeois capital class is fundamentally built on diverse material foundations than the experience of working people, and therefore the two cannot coincide. And that was what the Danish PBL revolution was constructed on. This idea was the very foundation of the Danish PBL model. And they tried to remedy that by making knowledge that would be centered around problems that were relevant to the working people, and they did that by working with trade unions, by working with companies, by working with organizations in society. Yes, it was very idealistic, but that's what they believed in. And finally, these guys also had a major influence in Denmark and later influenced every single PBL program because they actually came to put theory on top of what was essentially idealism. And these are the psychologists. The first one is a Russian. He died at a very young age. He was a kind of Da Vinci of education. He kind of did everything. He was a genius at everything he did. He died at the age of 38 from tuberculosis, but if he hadn't, Stalin would probably have had his head anyway. So, the second one is Jean Piaget, who had very similar ideas to Vygotsky, but we're not sure whether they were influenced by each other in the sense that Vygotsky's ideas didn't come out until the 1980s, really. But Piaget is a Swiss psychologist whose ideas were, you could argue, the foundation of modern psychology. And what did they say? Well, first of all, Vygotsky developed this idea of the zone of proximal development, and I'm going to explain it to you very quickly, because this is very important to your PBL learning. Imagine this is the field of, I don't know, let's choose economics. This is the field of economics, the big circle here. Now, in here is what you already know. And this is different for every single one of you. It's your supply-demand curve, if you know that already. It's things like, I know how much money I need to get back from my shopkeeper. It's little things to big things. It's theories to your concrete experience. That's all in here. And this is what, even if I told you about, you would not be able to understand it. So if I was to explain derivatives to you right now, you're probably looking at me like, huh? Because it's just too far out there. But there is a zone around it called the zone of proximal development, where with enough guidance, from a tutor perhaps, or from your other students, you could just learn that. But that zone is different for every single student. And so to cram standardized education into universities means that some people will stay in here and be bored. Some people will be out here and be completely lost. And other people will be just right. And I'm not going to use the word Goldilocks, I'm not going to use the word Goldilocks. But that's essentially it. And so the only way to deal with this would be a kind of personalized education. An education that responds to your own individual needs. Now, what does the tutor do, or the other students do in all this? It's called scaffolding, according to Jean Piaget. And scaffolding, well, it's kind of the idea of a scaffold. This is a scaffold. It's kind of building up to something else. What the tutor is, what I do in PBL, is that I try to push you into your zone of proximal development by asking questions that help you to build onto the next step of your knowledge, by making you think about something in a different way, the same way that I can provide you with a stepladder to something bigger or something more challenging. And scaffolding is really the foundation of these psychologists' ideas. And nowadays, of course, technology can also be a tool for scaffolding, not so much at the time Piaget wrote. So we start off with teachers being the major scaffolders, but hopefully when you get a little older, your second, third year, your masters will be able to do this amongst yourselves. And the question is, where does that leave us? Well, here you have the direction spectrum. This is something that my supervisor and I came up with. And it's the idea of where are programs located according to how unguided or how directed they are. And your lecture is all the way at that end. You're being told what to do, or what to learn. And the original Marxist PBL program for all the way at this end is essentially do what interests you. The original McMaster program I placed here because they had actually a medical exam at the end to take, so they kind of had to know stuff that was determined by other people. And the original master's program I put here because of the 7-step method, and also because they had some very strict assessment policies, of which William, who's standing behind there, was instrumental in creating, which is called the progress test. And a new kind of PBL model appeared in the 80s and 90s of people who wanted to do PBL but were a little bit shy about doing PBL, and so they called it the hybrid PBL model. And this is like, we'll have all our lectures, keep all our professors happy, and we'll stick in some PBL in there, you know, a couple of hours here, a couple of hours there. We'll call it a PBL program. And it became known as a PBL hybrid. They're actually more on this side of the learning spectrum. The founders of PBL, as they are today, have all faced a backward step towards directed learning, and they're more or less in the middle of the spectrum. And the question then is, where does that leave us now? Well, it's an important question, and by us, I don't mean us here, but us as people who have an interest in education, people who are interested in the essence of education. Where does it leave us with our education? And you know, I was a bit sad the other day because I read an article on BBC that said that your generation had no hope for the future. Well, I can kind of see why, you know. Because I've been around the world a couple times and I've seen what's happened to it, and it seems that Fukuyama may have been right, that somehow his fears of a monolithic capitalist machine have come true. And when I look around, it seems that even universities have become instruments of this mass production of mediocrity, cranking out PhD research, cranking out graduates for a commercialized value. And unlike the 60s and 70s, we seem to have destroyed the philosophy that served as a counterweight to the system. There's nothing left to fight this capitalist system, and that was exactly what Fukuyama was talking about. We've come at a place and at a time where we're alone standing against this phenomenon. And, well, why is this important? because we're a bit like blind mice now in education. You know, the story of the 3 blind mice. We're fumbling our way around, trying to find the road to this mystical promised land. And what is this promised land? Firstly, a safe job. Secondly, a high salary. Thirdly, a good career if you work hard and you get a good degree. That's gone. The certainty of that is long gone. Anybody who tells you that you can still get that from a university degree, as a matter of fact, it's not true anymore. Things have changed. The world is different. Certainty is gone. And so, where does that leave us? That's the important question. Well, do we want to be conditioned by Skinner's lab rats, rattling at the bars of our cages? And that by the time that cage door opens, we're so accustomed to our condition as rodents that the only thing we know how to do is to run out of that cage and straight into the rat race of the 21st century. Is that what we want from our education? Or do we want something different? Do we want to give them different meaning to education? Do you think that we should revive the humanist ideas of John Dewey and Carl Rogers? Well, if this is the behaviorist approach, let me give you another idea of education. Imagine an education in which you are freely led by your desire to learn, in which what you learn is connected to your everyday interests in your everyday life, in which you can direct your own learning. Imagine that you're free to learn, not for some predetermined goal set on high, but because it's relevant to you, to your life, to your world. Imagine that you can learn in such a way that will connect you to the outside community. Imagine that when you leave the benches of academia, you will not become cogs in the machine, but the very architects of that machine. All of these things are possible with PBL, and I would argue they are necessary. But you'll tell me, you know what? That's all nice, freedom to learn, but we need to learn stuff. You know, we need content. We need knowledge. Yes, you need knowledge. Notice the term knowledge. Information is slightly different. What happens if you passively accumulate masses of information, cram them in your head? Well, that's about as useful as storing crates of apples in your cellar, hoping to feed yourself for your whole life. And then you turn up a year later and you're hungry. Guess what? Your apples have all run to the core. Because if you passively accumulate information, all you will achieve is a temporary proficiency in a topic, never excellence. Because excellence requires a leap of faith. It requires you to believe that you can claim your own learning, and it requires that you own your own learning. Okay, so why is this important? Why do we care about this? Can't we just get on with things and, you know, figure our way out into reality in the education system? Once again, Carl Rogers had something to say about that. I'm a fan. He said, do I have some sense of mission, some notion that I can save education? And he said, I think not, though it will be for the reader to judge. My own conclusion is that the sense of urgency derives from my desire to contribute whatever I can to teachers and educators in a time of literally fearful crisis. And I think we can all agree that we've arrived once again in 2014 in a time of fearful crisis. But the difference is, once again, we have to make a choice. And unlike the 1960s, we've kind of lost the philosophers that could guide us. But I've shown you that there are ideas. There are many ideas we could borrow from. There are many things we could do. So the question is, what are you going to do with these ideas? Because now, it's power to you to claim your own freedom to learn. It's over to you. Thank you.